Welcome to the second part of this two-part lecture series on virtualization. So we will now discuss some advanced aspects of virtualization, some practical aspects, and some real problems that are faced in actual virtualization. So Solaris 10, which used to be the Unix-like operating system of SunSpark machines, was one of the pioneers in this field. So they started with the concept of zones, which is something similar to containers, something similar to what Docker provides these days. So what Docker provides is that it provides the illusion of a dedicated file system for an application. That one file system is dedicated for a single application. So typically, what happens is that for a single application, you may have certain libraries, certain configuration files. And for a different application, there'll be a different set of libraries and different configuration files. So often there is a lot of library conflict. So to solve that and to kind of give or distribute a custom environment, Docker containers are used where you distribute the application as well as the libraries and all the other files that it needs. So pretty much a file system is distributed. So zones takes this concept further. So it had a single global zone, which was the default, where you could run user programs, system programs, and all CPU memory, everything was visible. And then, of course, you could have these containerized areas where you had a dedicated file system with some user programs, some system programs, libraries, and so on. This area used to have its own network address, own access to devices, and it's again dedicated CPU and memory resources. So this was more like a virtual platform. I wouldn't say it was exactly like a virtual machine, because in a virtual machine, the CPU and memory are completely virtualized, and you also run an OS here. It's not the case that you're running an OS over here, but it is just that this is an isolated area for a couple of programs where they get a view that where they get a view that they own a part of the file system and they see the a unique view of CPUs, memory, network addresses, and files, of course. So Docker is a subset of this, but this was the original idea of zones. Then when we go further, let us now look at many other aspects of virtualization. So we have discussed CPU. So we would like to discuss memory management issues, CPU scheduling issues, IO storage issues, and of course VMM migration. So the key question is that how do virtual machines schedule CPU use? Because what will happen is that if I have a VMM over here, and let's say I have two VMs running their own guest OSs. So what will happen is that if there are 8 CPUs, the first VM will feel that it owns all 8 and the second VM will feel that it owns all 8. But what will happen is that it will actually get, let's say, 50% of the time. So then there will be a mismatch. The virtual machine and the guest OS are going to think that they are progressing at a certain rate because they have access to all the hardware and that too exclusively. But they will actually be progressing at half the rate, and this can cause it can cause serious problems if the OS is coded in a certain way. In the sense, it will lead to a correctness issue, but it will definitely lead to a performance issue. And furthermore, let's say that the total memory is 16 GB, but the first OS one requires 10 GB, the second requires 15 GB. Then what happens? So basically, then there is a problem. So as far as both are concerned, 10 and 15 are less than 16, but together they are more than 16. So there is a need to actually have something similar to a VM swap space where memory frames can be put in the swap area, in the swap region. So let us now discuss CPU scheduling. So what happens is that since virtual CPUs can be created, Even if it's a single CPU system, even if we have a single CPU in the system, an abstraction can be provided that let's say there are 4 CPUs or 8 CPUs. Of course, these are virtual CPUs, but pretty much, this a disconnect can be provided in the sense that if we have k CPUs over here, then the first OS can see that we have n CPUs, other can see we have m, and n can be greater than k, in fact, much, much greater, and m can also be greater. So, of course, there is a need for doing scheduling. And furthermore, the number of CPUs, if the system allows, and if the guest OSs are written in that way, they can be configured throughout the lifetime of the VM. So, of course, when we have enough CPUs for guests, so let's say that, let's consider a simplistic situation where n is less than k by 2 and m is less than k by 2. So, what we can do in this cases, we can give dedicated CPUs to guests, and then, our job is very easy. So, in that case, no CPU scheduling has to be done. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll have CPU overcommitment the moment n plus m is greater than k. So in this case, there is a need for using standard scheduling algorithms. And then again, the same old notions of fairness and sharing and all of those come in. So the key point over here is that we have to do some degree of cycle stealing by the VMM. So what I mean is that if a single CPU is shared between two guest OSs, all right, so then there is a problem. The problem that arises is basically that both of them will be assuming that they have complete control over the CPU. And let's say that every 100 milliseconds, they do some kind of a scheduling. So, what will happen is that they will assume that 10 slices have executed, each one of them will assume. But if let's say there is a 50-50 sharing, then only 5 slices would have executed. So, applications will appear to execute slower. So they need to somehow take care of that, and this should not cause a correctness issue, right? If it does, there is a problem. And also, if let's say they are deriving the time of the day based on the activity, based on the actual CPU time that they get, then of course this will be correct when there is no virtualization. But if there is virtualization, then this will become incorrect. So that's why modern operating systems have to be written in such a way that they will only rely on the timer interrupt. And also virtual machine monitors, virtual machine managers, VMMs, have to be written in a certain way that at least the timer interrupt is delivered to each of the virtual machines. Otherwise, they will lose track of time and the time of day clocks will become incorrect, which is a serious problem. So this is not something that we can overlook. So at least the timing of both the OSs has to be correct. So that is why the timer interrupts have to be delivered to each such that they can update. So here again, the basic there's a basic philosophical argument. So when we had para virtualization, it was clear that there is a contract between the OS and the VMM and the hypervisor. That look, the OS is aware of the fact that it's running on a hypervisor, and it was coded in that way. But what you can see is that in a modern avatar, when OSs are not aware that they are running and they are just coded the way that you would code them, as if they are running on an exclusive, as if they have exclusive access to CPU. Many subtle correctness problems can come in, particularly if timer interrupts are not regularly and consistently delivered. Then definitely the times will diverge and processes will appear to execute slower. So we cannot completely, wash away the fact that OSs need not be aware that they may run on a virtual machine, right? So I'm changing R to may. So this itself is a big change. But what I'm saying is that when developers develop an OS these days, they have to take this fact into account that their OS may run on a virtual machine. So they should not have any feature that would prevent their OS from doing that. And one such feature is don't derive the time out of a running program, particularly based on interrupts or something. You just trust the system timer or trust the VMM to deliver timer interrupts if that is an implicit contract with the VMM. So these are definitely sticky issues, and don't be utterly surprised, right, from the point of view of an OS if an application appears to execute slower than what it was meant to execute, because most likely the CPU is being co-opted and being given to another VM. So what we will see one example in the later half of the presentation where VMMs also provide certain applications that you can install on the guest OS that can directly communicate with the VMM and keep updating the time of the day. So this again breaks the virtualization that the guest OS is not aware of the fact that it's running on an hypervisor. But as I said, there are a lot of things, and ensuring that a guest OS is completely unaware is going to be very difficult. So some small compromises here and there have to be made, right? So we are introducing maybe a little bit, 1% of para virtualization over here. So the moment we have oversubscription, I'm just extending the previous argument. We require extra management efficiency from the VMM, in the sense that the VMM now has to do the job of CPU scheduling, and it needs to provide a degree of fairness to all the operating systems that are running on top of it. So let us now look at some aspects of memory virtualization and discuss why the virtualization abstraction at least sometimes needs to be slightly relaxed. So if you look at the ultra popular VMware ESX system, which is a type 1 hypervisor, so what it does is it configures guests with a given amount of physical memory. Then it has three methods of memory management. So the first is a standard double paging scheme in which the guest simply maintains its page table. So the guest doesn't care. But if the guest says that a given page is in a physical frame, so then what will happen is that that is what the guest believes. But the VMM is free to move it to some kind of a backing store, or which is the swap space in this case, if it actually runs out of space. So the key idea over here is that if it is running out of space, then what it does is that it implements swapping on its own, unbeknownst to the guest OS. The other option, the second option, is to slightly break the abstraction of the fact that the guest OS is unaware that it is running on a VMM. The OS is still unaware, but what we do is we play a little trick. So we install a pseudo device driver, so which is not a device driver for an actual device, but is actually a device driver for the hypervisor. So hypervisor VMM are the same term, just in case you have been missing that up till now. So to the guest kernel, it looks like a regular device driver. It runs in kernel mode. So it has a balloon memory manager, which actually communicates directly with the VMM. So there is a mechanism, a channel for doing so, either via specialized instructions or via a specialized memory region, to basically allocate or deallocate the memory that is available to the guest. So this basically is like it's kind of like a Trojan horse. It's kind of like a spy. It is a VMM spy within the guest OS, which is analyzing its memory usage and essentially telling the VMM with regards to how much of memory it needs to allocate uh, to the guest OS. Then, of course, there is another trick that you can do. So, at the VMM level, if it sees that multiple guest OSs are actually loading the same data, same page more than once, it can all memory map them to the same page and essentially save on physical memory. So, with regards to I/O, there is a lot of variation because I/O devices are really varied, and there is often little standardization, even though a lot of standardization work has been done. But let's say USB and PCI, for example, look very different. So that's the reason they have very segregated and often very flexible device drivers. So it is the job of the VMM to kind of provide a device driver which encapsulates them and provides a simple interface to all the guest OSs. So overall IO is complicated. I'll tell you why. Because many standard OSs have these short paths for improved performance. So let's say they have direct access to the network card's memory in the case of a network card, or vice versa. So many of these short paths are actually used. But the moment a guest OS actually runs on a VMM, these short paths cannot be used. So this causes a problem. So that's the reason this term has come up called pass-through virtualization. So what pass-through virtualization basically means is that in some cases, the VMM can create a direct connection between the IO device and the guest OS. It doesn't have to go through the VMM. So the less the hypervisor needs to do, the better it is. So that's the reason occasionally direct device access can be given when security is less of a concern. Similar pass-through can be given to DMA because DMA is very, very performance sensitive. And interrupts can be delivered directly in the sense that instead of the interrupts coming to the VMM, the interrupt handler of the guest OS can be directly registered with the hardware and the interrupt can be directly delivered to the hardware. But often what happens is that these things get complicated. That's the reason some hardware support is required to ensure that these things happen correctly, particularly if there are multiple guest OSs. And we are looking at the timer interrupt. So as we have discussed 2 slides before, the timer interrupt has to be delivered. If you don't deliver the timer interrupt, then the wall clocks will run out of sync. So traditionally, what hardware does is that for a given interrupt, it only delivers it to one address, one interrupt handler. But in this case, if we have the hardware support, I'm not saying that we have it all the time, but it would be desirable to have such that if there are 3 guest OSs, the timer interrupt can be delivered to all three, and all three of them can then work on it, right? Otherwise, what you needs to be done is that it has to be delivered to the VMM, and the VMM then has to raise some sort of a pseudo interrupt to these operating systems to tell them that look, one time slice has passed, right? To give them an idea that the timer interrupt has happened. So this is where again, hardware can take some load of the VMM and make things easier, make things simpler. Another issue is of course networking, which is almost as complex as it can get over here. So the idea again here is that you can, for the networking aspect of the work, you can go through the VMM. So here some interesting things are possible. The IP address can be hidden, the network address, the MAC address that is being shown to the guest OS, that can be hidden. So what can be done is we can do network address translation, which essentially means that the address that is being seen by the guest OS and the address that is actually being seen by the ultimate receiver are different because the VMM does a translation. So it can kind of hide the identity of the guest, which in many cases is quite desirable. So coming to storage, so something similar needs to be done with the disk as was done with memory. So the VMM needs to provide support for both general disk accesses as well as it needs to provide the boot disk. Right, so these are kind of separate. The first is quite privileged. So when you're booting the boot partition, that's a fairly privileged activity, but generalized data access is not that privileged. But nonetheless, the VMM has to support both. It also needs to support potentially dozens of guests per VMM. So let's now look at type 1, the first type. So it can store the guest root disks and other configuration informations within the file system of the VMM. And so basically the entire guest's image is just stored as a single file or a bunch of files within the VMM's file system. So in a type 1 hypervisor, this can be done because a type 1 is still a very thin OS. And type 2 hypervisors, which are like full-fledged OSs, They can simply use their file system to store the image of the guest OS, and it can be managed in that way. So if the file is duplicated, it's basically like creating a new guest. If you move the file to another system, it is same as migration. And of course, what the guest OS is seeing is it is seeing a virtual hard drive. Let's call it a VHDD, a virtual hard drive. And what we actually have is a real hard drive. So here again, similar to what we did in the case of memory, here again, what needs to be done is that native disk blocks have to be converted to VMM, to the VMM format, in the sense they need to be converted to actual disk blocks, at least in terms of addresses, and vice versa. And furthermore, along with local hard drive storage, if there is network attached storage, that also needs to be provided. So as you can see, the VMM is a fairly complex piece of software, in the sense its job is to take all kinds of devices. In this case, we're looking at the hard drive, and then convert the addresses in such a way that the guest OS is completely unaware of the fact that it is actually looking at a virtual hard drive, not a real one. So let's now look at an interesting aspect, an interesting facet of virtual machines, which has really made it very powerful, and which has also allowed large systems such as Amazon AWS and other cloud providers to actually work. So we take advantage of VMM features which are not there, or which were not there in operating systems. And then the key idea is that a running guest, so running guest OS can simply be live migrated to from one physical machine to one more. So the way it happens is like this. The source VMM establishes a connection with the target VMM, indicating that a guest OS would like to move. If the target accepts, it creates a new guest, which means it creates the data structures for a new guest and initializes vCPUs. So then what the source needs to do is it needs to send the state of the program to the target. So in this case, it will start with sending all the read-only guest memory pages to the target. So once all the read-only guest memory pages have been sent, the source will then send all the read-write pages to the target. So mind you, there is a race condition over here, in the sense the source may believe that a page is read-only, but then it's possible that its parameters would have been changed. And the other is that the source would send read write pages to the target, but it's possible that somebody during this time may have made an update. So that is why these steps are repeated several times to ensure that they are quickly sent, to ensure that while sending, if any changes are happening, it's very little. So initially what will happen is that a lot of data needs to be sent. That will take a lot of time. In that time, a lot of pages will be overwritten. Again, if we send it, it will be much faster. So in that time, a fewer number of pages will be overwritten. So gradually it will become a convergent series where the time, these steps will become very short. Once they become very short and we know that, most of the data has been transferred and whatever is changing is not much, the source will freeze the VMM, in the sense it will not allow it to execute more instructions. It will collect the final state of all the virtual CPUs and all other IO devices and everything. Everything that needs to be collected, all the state that needs to be collected, send the final set of dirty pages in memory, and tell the target to start the running guest after it has fully transferred and initialized the state, right? After it has fully transferred and set the state, it starts running the guest. And once the guest starts running, the target acknowledges that, and the source then cleans up its data structures for the guest OS. So this is shown over here. We have a running guest. So you establish a connection with the target. Then what happens is that the target creates the data structures. First, we send the read-only pages, then the read-write pages. This process is done repeatedly, not the read-only part, but the read-write pages are sent repeatedly. So as I've said, this gradually becomes a convergent series because the time taken to transfer and the number of pages updated, that both of them keep reducing till a certain point. After that, we freeze the guest and we send the source, send the entire state of the program. Then then the issue is that the target starts running the guest and it acknowledges. So this is where the source VMM terminates the guest OS and cleans up its state. So migration nowadays is very fast. In modern data structures, it can happen in a couple of seconds if we have a very high bandwidth link. Otherwise, it can take more time. It can take up to an order of minutes. But that said and done, this is one of the most powerful tools of creating a cloud computing data center. Had VMM migration not been there, it would have actually been a very serious problem. So some examples. So VMware was one of the earliest companies which started making Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors. So Type 2 hypervisors, of course, run as native applications and they support all kinds of guests, Windows, Linux, and so on. And the virtualization layer abstracts the underlying hardware and also provides the guest with own virtual CPUs, memory, disk drives, network interfaces, everything. Physical disks can be provided to guests if, let's say, if we have enough physical disks, right? The number of physical disks is more than the number of guests. Otherwise, the same need to be virtualized as we have discussed. So this would be an example of a typical VMware-like system where we have the hardware, we have the host operating system with applications, and then we have a virtualization layer where we are running different guest operating systems. So as you can see, FreeBSD, Windows NT, Windows XP, they are all different. So now we come to what I have been calling Type 3 virtual machines, but they are not known as Type 3. They are essentially programming language virtual machines such as Java, which are very popular. They popularize the term write once, run anywhere, run everywhere. The key idea was that we actually take a .java file, we compile it to a .class file, which assumes a virtual machine, a very simple stack-based virtual machine. So this doesn't use regular native instructions, but it uses Java bytecode. And then while running, the Java virtual machine does a just-in-time compilation and converts this into native machine code, and then this runs. So the advantage of this is that the .class file can be distributed. You don't get to see the source, and you have the write once, run anywhere feature. So a simple illustration of that, we have our .class files. A class loader loads them along with other parts of the Java API. Then there is a Java interpreter. So we don't go instruction by instruction. So what we do is we take a bunch of instructions, do a just-in-time compilation, come up with native machine code and run it on the host system. So of course, over here, we can perform similar similar optimizations as was done for the KMU virtual machine. So instead of translating, single instruction by instruction, we can take a block of instructions, translate them and cache them. And also, if when we learn more about the program and its execution patterns, what we can do is that we can maybe recompile parts of the code and just keep doing so, and they will keep getting more and more and more efficient. The virtualization research, the last part that we will discuss are something called unikernels. So a unikernel is an interesting new angle for creating a virtualized system. The idea of a unikernel is to basically create a single bundle of the software, libraries that of course the software needs, and the relevant part of the OS that the software needs. So essentially we create one single application that runs in kernel mode. So it is quite efficient. So the key point over here, The key point over here is that, of course, we are sacrificing flexibility, but we are creating a very efficient bundle. So let me now come to what's a library operating system. Consider a traditional library. It has a lot of books, but we only get the books that we require, right? And we only keep those books on our desk, on our shelf. So this is very similar. We only fetch those functions and that part of the OS that we require, and then that is bundled along with the software, and we create a unique kernel. It used to be quite popular, but it's not all that popular as of now. So the idea, of course, is to improve efficiency and security and not have, drivers and all other loopholes in a traditional operating system that reduce its security. You have a specialized machine image that has a single address space, a reduced attack surface, and also the resource footprint of a deployed application is not that much. So, for example, if you just want to create a server that will be a file server or a web server, we don't need hundreds of libraries and we don't need a large part of the OS also. So, what we can do is we can just create a very customized software, which is like a kernel plus application software combo. So, we can compile our application, library, and kernel services all into a single binary and make it a virtual environment. So, we have much better control of processes. But as I said, of course, flexibility goes out of the window. But that said and done, for specialized applications, not a bad idea. Look at the Quest 5 project. So that looks at real-time execution and fault tolerance using special virtualization instructions. So the key idea is that hypervisors partition the physical resources. So they fully commit all resources, they don't overcommit. So you could have a general area where some resources are given to general purpose programs, but you could have another specialized partition for real-time programs where a unique kernel can run, and that will have complete control over this part, and no other application that is not a part of the unique kernel can actually access any resource in this part. For example, a traditional Linux system lacks the real-time capabilities or safety and security capabilities that are required in a lightweight, real-time or secure OS. But what we can do is that we can create a partition of this kind, and we can give a Linux system the power to execute secure, real-time, time-critical tasks. Right? So this is doable. So separation hypervisors like Quest 5 essentially run every task in their own virtual machines. If you can think about it, for a task, we create a virtual machine. This virtual machine has complete control over a part of the system, and this ensures that we have real-time guarantees as well as security guarantees. So the hypervisor initializes the system and starts and runs the task, but it is clearly not involved in its continuing operation, primarily because the relevant parts of the OS and application take over. Each VM has its own dedicated resources that the task manages. Needless to say, this is for real time and secure tasks. Don't even ask questions about flexibility. Other examples are Extratum, Siemens, Jailhouse, and so on. So essentially, the idea is that we can have many such VMs on a chip and create a chip level distributed system. Furthermore, we can create secured shared memory channels that can be implemented using the standard paging mechanism or other inter-task communication mechanisms such that these containers can talk to each other. So many projects have started coming up in this space in robotics, self-driving cars, and so on. Many of the modern real-time systems, real-time system applications that will benefit by such kind of partitioning. All right, so this ends chapter 18. This was all about virtualization, but virtualization is a very popular and growing field, and a lot of research is happening. So, new developments are happening every day. So, readers who are more interested can look at relevant research papers to find out what is happening in this field these days.